I'm really very excited to see what happens tonight with our panelists, because in many ways they are contemporary leaders of the abolitionist, the anti-slavery sort of cause and focus of today. This was a subject that was of deep interest to Mary Baker Eddy. She wrote about slavery before her founding and discovery of Christian Science. She penned verse that was published in newspapers and magazines in support of the abolitionist cause. And then after she had developed her career as a spiritual thinker and spiritual leader, she wrote very passionately and forcefully on the subject of the importance of facing down slavery in all of its manifestations. And for her, it was the capacity of enslaving conditions to sort of grip our mind, our individual and our collective consciousness, that she thought was really at the heart of what we needed to reform and live up to our potential. So it's just going to be a delight to talk about this with our panelists. So let me introduce them to you. Immediately to my right is the Reverend Gloria White-Hammond, and Gloria is co-pastor at the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. She, along with Liz Walker, founded My Sister's Keeper, which is a woman-led humanitarian organization dedicated to lending sisterly assistance to communities of women in various locations throughout the world. Their present focus is on supporting the aspirations of women in the African country of Sudan. Gloria is a medical doctor who for many years practiced pediatrics in the Boston area. She's also been engaged in serving Boston youth through various forms of social outreach. Then next to Gloria is Ned Eames. Ned founded Tenacity in 1999 to serve under-resourced public school students here in Boston, whose English language art scores are significantly below grade level. While Tenacity's summer program makes reading and tennis available to 4,000 Boston children each summer at 25 neighborhood sites, its school year excellence program combines intensive literacy, life skills, and tennis instruction, leading students on a journey from the 6th grade all the way to high school graduation, in a city where about 40% of minorities and low-income whites do not earn a diploma. And then next to Ned is Reverend Dr. Kaya Stern. And Kaya directs the Pathways Home project at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School. Her work focuses on transformative justice and education in prison, with specific attention to the experiences of people after incarceration. Kaya has a doctorate in religion from Emory University and is an interfaith minister. So Gloria, Ned, Kaya, I'd like to begin our conversation tonight by just learning a little bit more about you in your own words. And if you could tell us about the work you do and the path that has brought you to your work.
Sure. Before the genocide in Darfur and Western Sudan, there were comparable atrocities in southern Sudan and Nuba Mountains, all of which were facilitated by the current government of Sudan. Especially during the latter conflicts, oftentimes untold numbers of women and children were captured from their villages in the south and then taken to villages in the north where they were sold into slavery. Subsequently, southern Sudanese developed what was a very elaborate underground railroad. Reminds you somewhat of the Underground Railroad that was familiar to us in American history. In which they sought to free their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, their friends, and their children. And in July of 2001, I followed Liz Walker and another, well, my really bestest friend, my husband Ray, to Sudan because we wanted to look at this Underground Railroad, which was rather controversial. My first encounter with returning slaves was on July 4th, 2001. And as I talked with so many women and heard the stories of unconscionable abuse they had experienced and had survived, I was convinced that I had traveled 6,000 miles and had left the land of the free and arrived in the home of the brave. As I first noted, my first trip I was following Liz and Ray. And my second trip I felt led to return to Sudan to understand better how I might possibly address this issue. And with that trip, I was stretched way beyond my zone of comfort and found myself sometimes drowning deep in a sea of faith. I felt overwhelmed by the stories that I heard from individuals that I encountered. I cried with a woman who, when she was taken from her village, had 2 small toddlers. She begged to carry her toddlers rather than being forced to take the loot from the village, and said that she was concerned that her toddlers would not survive if she just left them. And so the raiders shot her 2 toddlers and taunted her by saying, "Problem solved." Again, I felt utterly overwhelmed, and in that moment had a conversation with God in which I made it very clear that I did not have the right stuff to address this plight, and therefore God should simply beam me up. But I then engaged in a conversation in which God reminded me that as a well-educated, highly favored African-American woman, that I did not come from generations of previous slaves and long line of Black descendants who ever had the luxury of giving up in the face of injustice. And I, for the first time, saw myself through a different set of eyes, as a vision that wasn't lynched, and as a promise that refused to be silenced.
I'm eager to share a little bit about tenacity, but I'd first like to just put a couple ideas out on the table first. First, despite the truly gallant efforts of many individuals, some friends, children from Boston's lower-income families are not getting the education that they deserve. Second, these students obviously have all the potential of materially more well-off suburban children, and they do respond positively when given the support and opportunity any child needs. During the mid-90s, I was working as a management consultant with large corporate clients on issues that fall under the banner of organizational behavior and strategic change. I'd worked hard to earn this position. It was intellectually interesting and exciting, and the assignments were great, but as I started to see the realities of the corporate context were perhaps not best match for how I was seeing my career aspirations unfold. The growing realization that I needed to make a change left me feeling absolutely lost. In searching for an answer, the word tennis kept coming to me. Although I played a great deal of competitive tennis through my early 20s, I had, in starting my work career, purposely moved away from the game and had no idea why the notion of working in tennis was coming to thought. It made no sense and frankly bothered me. I had had the benefit of what felt to me like 2 perspective-changing experiences. First, moving from a prep school to a low-income housing project for several years and attending off-the-wall alternative schools. And second, the spiritual growth necessitated by intense on-court competition and distance from family. Together, they suggested to me that while we are all unique, we are at the same time all the same, no matter what the outward appearances or background. So just briefly, back to the career fork that I had faced in leaving consulting, I realized for the first time in my life that what I needed to be willing to put service of others first. With that in mind, and having been introduced to a couple sports-based youth development programs, I discovered my next career step and decided to start what has become Tenacity here in Boston.
I walked into a maximum security prison in 1993 as a student at Vassar College. And I now know, upon reflection, that day my life was changed. I think of Reverend James Lawson, who signals a kind of holy conversation that we have with ourselves, something that happens that we have no words for. And it happened in the moment that I saw the sunlight refract off of the shackles around a man's ankles, and it blinded me, it temporarily blinded me, and something happened. I grew up in New York City. I went to a predominantly Jewish prep school. Most of my teachers and friends and family members were of the feeling that faith is the opiate of the masses. And something was born in me, something was remembered in that moment, and I went home and just wept and wept and wept. And I think I wept for about 3 months, almost dropped out of college. The one thing that did sustain me was this incredible internship, and I had the opportunity to continue to visit for the duration of my senior year, 3 days a week, Greenhaven Prison in upstate New York. And it was from those men there who are in an environment, have any of you ever visited a prison in the United States? Okay, so you can probably testify in your own words that it is one of the most dehumanizing environments, both for the massive workforce behind bars, the family members who come visit, and the people who are locked up. And it's an environment that academics say is a totalizing institution. It is an environment that annihilates the human spirit and cripples the human body. And there was something about the juxtaposition of speaking to people who had a profound faith. I was introduced to various faith populations behind bars, right, in what we call the belly of the beast. And I knew from that moment, it was over 15 years ago, that this was my path, this was my work, this was my service that fed me and made me feel free, right? Reminded me in what ways was I enslaved, and in what ways, in the most oppressive environment I had ever witnessed, people were talking about liberation and relationship to God. I had this breakdown and this breakthrough, and thought I wanted to go to law school. I dropped out after half a day. I found myself hiding in the bathroom, realizing that it was not my path, and I called a beloved mentor, and was saying that I have so much faith in the law that can't be written. And he encouraged me to apply to divinity school. So I went to Harvard Divinity School, again, not being connected to any religious institution. I don't have a conventional relationship to religion, and ended up pursuing doctoral work in religion and looking at the ways that religious institutions, for the most part, are really silent in the face of mass incarceration. And religious ideology, the notions of who's human and who can be forgiven and who's saved and what is just, is really rooted in our theology and our ideology. I'm blessed right now to be working at an institute for race and justice out of Harvard Law School. It's called the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute. All of our work can be understood as part of the inclusion project. What are policies and practices that include people, and what are those that exclude people? And our work focuses on what many call the school-to-prison pipeline, looking at people coming out of prison, looking at racial disparities in the death penalty. So Charles Hamilton Houston was Thurgood Marshall's mentor and laid the groundwork for the Brown v. Board of Ed case, and why are schools more racially segregated now than they were in 1954. So our work is to kind of pursue his unfinished work in that spirit of equity and opportunity for all.
So I'm curious as to what you think are the main issues that need to be faced down, and what it is that you find is most effective in sustaining you and is effective in sort of bringing about steps that are leading us in a right direction, and in a right direction that can maybe hold, that can be sustained, that goes beyond wonderful ideas, wonderful visions, but really can take root and make a meaningful and lasting difference in people's lives and in our world.
Well, I think of injustice as being oftentimes being fueled by at least three different things. One is greed, and the sense that what I have is not enough and I must have more, to the exclusion of other people. That's also manifested in power, a greed for power. And once again, that I can only be powerful by rendering other people impotent. But I think it's also fueled by fear, and the fear of confronting injustice, the fear that if I stand up, that others will, that I won't be accepted. So those are the three things that I often think about when I think about what needs to be addressed.
I'm going to go the theological route and ask us to consider the possibility that traditional theology is in exile from itself. Parts of it is enslaved to its very self, that in the name of mercy and in the name of justice and in the name of Jesus of Nazareth, we continue to commit the most common blasphemy every single day, where we do not look at each other, and you were talking about dignity, Gloria. Realize the dignity of that, the sanctity of being human or being created in what we call the image of God, and how that brokenness is so common. So in terms of what leads us in the right direction and facing down the things that we consider to enslave us, both within ourselves, in society, and structural forces at large, I would say, yes, that we can resist the most common blasphemy. We can look each other in the eye. We can recognize the humanity of the people in our midst, and that is radical. And that is, that to take, Jesus as an example, as a human example of someone who didn't turn away from affliction, and how rare and blessed that is. That is, I think we find that everywhere. And that to me is what sustains me. And I think I appreciate your bringing up greed, because I heard someone speaking on NPR recently describing what it was like as a child to walk into a birthday party and see all the children playing musical chairs. Does everybody know what musical chairs is? Right, you can't really grow up in the United States and go to a birthday party and not know what musical chairs is. But if we think, I remember learning the rules of the game. And you have to be real quick or slick or aggressive, going around the corner and listen, the music, and you push each other out. And what is the lesson that we're teaching our children? The lesson is that there's not enough, and the lesson is that there's only one winner, right? And so I think that part of I think it's an illusion of scarcity. I mean, we're talking about this economic crisis, and we can summon trillions of dollars for bailouts of certain individuals or corporations, and yet not the communities that are under-resourced. And so what is it that we're teaching our children? Is it really, isn't there an abundance? Isn't there an abundance of grain to feed people who are hungry? Isn't there an abundance in this very room to heal people and counter the things that enslave us every day? I would say yes.
Your comments make me think of something that Mary Baker Eddy wrote in her chief work, Science and Health. She writes, legally to abolish unpaid servitude in the United States was hard, but the abolition of mental slavery is a more difficult task. Men and women of all climes and races are still in bondage to material sense, ignorant how to obtain their freedom. The rights of men were vindicated in a single action when African slavery was abolished in our land. that was only prophetic of further steps towards the banishment of a worldwide slavery found on higher planes of existence and under more subtle and depraving forms. And I think that, sometimes we're not even conscious of the kind of apathy, the kind of acquiescence that can sort of take over our spirit and our consciousness, and an acceptance that we have to live with things the way that they are. And your description of sort of the crisis in theology also makes me think of Mary Baker Eddy, because it was a crisis that she felt after she had had a critical discovery about really the healing potential and the divine right that all humanity has for health and well-being, and how difficult it was in her time to get an audience from the established religious order of the time for this very, very liberating idea.
To your point, Kaya, we've lost sight of our spirituality as a society. Religion, organized religion, has not been popular, and our organizations that we work in to make a living are mechanical and set up around profit, and we've lost touch with that side of ourselves. And I've made a few comments about the organizational structure of the schools and how that needs to change to allow our kids to blossom. But that structure isn't the whole answer, as is being pointed out here. There needs to be a regeneration of values that put more value on the greater good, as opposed to simply supplying for ourselves. And I know that in my work, I'm very much a work in progress, and there are people within my own the organization that I work in Tenacity, who at times seem far more unselfish and enlightened and dedicated than I feel at times. And another dynamic that goes on in this work is that it's really, really hard. It's round the clock. It's every day, it's every week, it's month after month, it's year after year.
I think it is easier sometimes to get the sense that you're just doing this grind, and is it really making a difference? And I'm encouraged by a couple of phenomena. One is Nelson Mandela, who, when I had read his book, A Long Walk to Freedom, I read it because I really wondered what he thought about during those 25 plus years that he was imprisoned. And he said that it never occurred to him that they would not defeat apartheid. He just never wrapped his mind around that possibility. And so that's how you be in jail for all those years, and you get out and you're not crazy and you're not bitter, and then you go on to become the president of this country, and we've all watched apartheid come tumbling down. And certainly as a person of African descent, again, my ancestors strived for something that was not within their view. And on Friday, I'll go to another meeting at the White House. I was there 4 years ago, and I met the previous president talking about Sudan. It never occurred to me that I would go back again and be talking about the same subject, but what really never occurred to me was that this time I would be meeting an African American as president. We keep hope alive.
Thank you very much for sharing your stories. I appreciate that. I wanted to get your thoughts on this particular topic that we're having this evening, which is slavery and a contemporary story. When I hear that, I think of people of color, people who reflect me, and along with other people who may have in some way experienced slavery, either via their gender or other ways. And this topic really needs to be very inclusive. And so as I sit here today and I look around this audience, I think to myself, this is great. There's a large number of people here. but a good portion of these people don't really look like me. And how can we make this more inclusive to really get people in my community to be a part of conversations like this so that they better understand what is self-oppression, self-slavery, how does class and privilege and racism fit into this? And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I can tell you how, at least in my experience, how we've begun to do some of this, and it's by way of relationships, and daring to meet each other at this kind of crossroads and determining that, and it's hard. I mean, it's like really hard work to talk to people who are different. It's exciting, we love it, and diversity, but it is real work. But at least starting by determining that we will have the conversation, that rather than talk about each other, at each other, around each other, we will do the hard work of talking to each other, and we will hold ourselves accountable around doing that in a civil way. And that, for me, has been one of the most exciting. I've done a number of things over the years, right? So one of the interesting experiences that I've had is in developing relationships with a Jewish community, a Jewish congregation that's real different from our congregation, but it has been one of the richest experiences that we've had. And so we took a big risk, and so we're continuing to grow that.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming here and for what you all do. Each of the things you've chosen to work on is amazing, and the work you've done is very impressive and very inspiring. You talked about people who make a difference, and since all of three of you are people who have made a difference, would you each be willing to share one story of a person to whom you have made a difference and how their lives have been touched by what you have done for them, which I think for me would be a lovely way to go home, just focusing on how we can support and pray about what you're doing, because you are making a difference, and that would help us picture how.
Would Richard Wilson please stand up? Richard. Richard is my inspiration. We met 10 years ago when we were just launching and recruiting young students for our after-school program, and Richard was part of that recruitment process, and frankly was acting up, and he basically had no chance of being admitted, but came up to me and said, "I know you're not going to pick me," and we took a second look, and what we saw behind that was a tremendous reaching out and request to be picked. And this young man has gone through amazing challenges through his middle school years, high school, and he's now bravely working and putting himself through college. And so he's my inspiration.
And I have a little friend named Elizabeth who we met about 3.5 years ago, and the school that we just built was started in 2003, and so Elizabeth, like I said, we met about 3.5 years ago, and she was very, very quiet and shy. I relate to that because I struggle in a similar way. And I often ask children when I go into the schools, what do you want to be? And everybody wants to be a doctor. And anyway, so she said, like most girls do, she wanted to be a doctor, but she kind of whispered, she said, I want to be a doctor. And so I said to her, well, from now on, because people call me Dr. Gloria, we're going to call you Dr. Elizabeth. And so then I said to her, so what is your name? And she said, Dr. Elizabeth. And then I turned to the other girls and I said, so what is her name? And they yelled, Dr. Elizabeth! Well, now when we go back, Dr. Elizabeth practically runs the school. And what the headmaster said to us was that that moment was a real turning point for Elizabeth, who was really always sought the back of the line, the corner, whatever. And now she's large and in charge. And what it says is more than anything, it's about speaking promise into the life of, in this case, a young woman. So when I tell people about the school and the building, and it's not so much about the mortar and bricks, it's about promise and potential and helping a young girl realize, you can do that, girl.